Here in New England, we are currently in peak town meeting session. That's the annual ritual, often linked to this iconic Norman Rockwell image in which the residents of a community gather not just as neighbors, but as their own lawmakers. In Massachusetts, in towns with less than 6,000 people, anyone eligible can show up and cast a vote on the business at hand, a so-called open town meeting. Bigger towns can go that route or use what's called a representative town meeting, in which a smaller group of participants are elected beforehand. Right now, the town of Sandwich is mulling a change from open to representative, partly thanks to dwindling attendance. But in the Berkshires, the town of Lee is about to go in the opposite direction, holding an open town meeting for the first time in more than 5 decades. Joining me to talk about that switch is Sarah Wright, who will be moderating the Lee town meeting when it kicks off next month, and Susan Clark, the co-author of All Those in Favor, a book about Vermont town meetings. She's also the co-author of Slow Democracy, Rediscovering Community, Bringing Decision-Making Back Home. And she's the town meeting moderator in Middlesex, Vermont. Thank you both for being here. Sarah, what made the town of Lee decide it was going to switch from the leaner and more efficient representative format to the open town meeting?
Thank you for that question, Adam, and thank you so much for covering Western Mass, or as we call it, Bestern Mass.
Happy to.
So there hasn't been an open town meeting in Lee, as you mentioned, in 50 years plus, so not since 1968. We are going back to the future, if you will. And I think the primary cause that led to open town meeting is mostly related to what's called the Rest of River settlement and the whole story of GE as a large employer there for many years, unfortunately dumping a lot of toxic waste into the Housatonic River. 5 towns a few years back negotiated what's called Rest of River settlement. And that part of that settlement includes a toxic PCB dump in the town of Lee. It hasn't come yet, but it's obviously very upsetting to all of us who live there. And I think that's the real reason behind going back to open town meeting.
When you say that's the big reason, does that suggest that the residents of Lee, as this new threat to the community looms, that they just want to have a sense of maximum agency and the ability to decide their own future with this thing lurking in the background? Is that what you're thinking?
I think that's exactly right, Adam. When we had our annual town meeting in 2021, only the representatives could vote on the question. It was a citizen's petition at the time. It was a close vote. It passed by 2 votes. When it went to the ballot a year later as a referendum, it was 65 to 390. So I think you're exactly right.
Okay. Susan, when town meetings work well, as someone who's written about this institution, studied them, thought about them, when they work well, what do they accomplish that other decision-making structures don't?
Well, you mentioned the town meeting as a legislature, and I think especially for folks who aren't from New England, this is a real eye-opener because it's very different from what we see across the U.S., the town hall meetings, where in these situations we really do have extraordinary power. We vote on budgets, we amend, and take direct action. And so government is a we and not a they. And that changes us. It changes us as people, how we govern year in, year out, decade after decade, century after century. We are better at understanding and respecting the democratic process and the outcomes if we play an active role. So it strengthens our skills, it strengthens our trust in the process, and we're also just more likely to be better informed voters when we know we're going to be face-to-face like this.
Sarah, what have skeptics of the shift that is underway in Lee, what have skeptics of the shift said about the concerns they have, and how are you trying to assuage any concerns that they might have going in?
Right. To be honest, haven't heard a lot of skepticism, and maybe that's just because I haven't been privy to it. I've read about it. I'm following what's going on in Sandwich too, where they're thinking about going in the opposite direction. And I think that the gist of the skepticism, such as it is that when you go from representative to open and every town meeting member can vote, that people may not be as prepared for town meeting as they would be otherwise if it were a representative town meeting. Those representatives in Lee came from 6 different districts. We had, until last year, we had about 54 representatives who all did, I know, their due diligence prior to each meeting. I am quite confident that my fellow citizens, all the town meeting members who will show up on May 11th will show up prepared as well. But I think that there is some doubt about that, and time will tell.
So tell me if I've got this right. In Lee, you are holding 1 or 2 events prior to the actual town meeting to help people get up to speed on the issues that are going to be discussed and debated there and voted on, right? You're trying to get people primed so that they come in with a certain base of knowledge?
Yes. And I think that, again, we had our baby town meeting last night, and we went through the warrant itself, which will be signed off on in the next week or so. And so it's been out there, and you can go to the town website and you can see what we're going to discuss. We have, I think, 23 warrant articles. 2 of those are citizen petitions. One's about being a pollinator-friendly community, my personal favorite. But you're right, as Susan said, it's mostly about, in the first place, accepting the budget reports, going over operating capital budgets, and so forth. And I think that the citizens of Lee have been very highly engaged over the last so many years, given the controversy that I mentioned earlier.
Susan, I hadn't realized until I started trying to get ready for this segment a couple days ago, I hadn't realized the extent to which the value or lack of value of the New England town meeting is a subject of some pretty heated debate. There are people like you who see it as offering a way to practice a better kind of politics, create new relationships within a community, bonds in a community that might not exist otherwise. But then it seems to me there are some people who think the virtues of the town meeting as it's been practiced in New England for a few hundred years has been overstated, and also that it may just be an antiquated institution. I want to quote one person. There was an article I found from a journal I'd never known existed called the Journal of Public Deliberation. And a historian named Michael Zuckerman from the University of Pennsylvania wrote the following at the close of his piece. The town meetings of the 18th century were part of a world we have lost. The aspiration of that world was to a unanimity that we would find suffocating. The hallmark of that world was an intolerance of divergent opinions that we would find intolerable. I'm curious, as a town meeting advocate and champion, do you think that any of the criticisms voiced by skeptics like Michael Zuckerman have some merit?
Oh, it's fascinating. It's a really rich conversation, and I think that that's what democracy is for, is to continue these kinds of conversations. I think the biggest tension in terms of town meeting versus, say, a ballot is the tension between democratic quantity and democratic quality. So a democratic, and those are 2 good things. We want them both, and we shouldn't see it as an either or. We should try to figure out how we can have both and. And that's sort of the definition of a polarity or a paradox, is when 2 good things are in tension.
When you talk about quantity and quality, are you referring to the participation level, how many residents come out, and then whether they actually participate in the conversation, whether they yell at each other or raise thoughtful points, whether they listen to their fellow citizens? Is that the sort of stuff you mean?
So with ballot voting, we tend to get more turnout. It's simpler, it's easier, it's more direct to cast a ballot than it is to sit in a hard chair for multiple hours. So we know that. And so, you could say that is more accessible, more inclusive, a ballot vote. On the other hand, at a town meeting, we are able to see and hear each other, sort of holistically, as neighbors, as whole people. It's not just, that's that guy with that bumper sticker.
Yeah.
That's a person who has a more complex perspective than maybe I thought. So we can not only change possibly change their mind, but we might even be able to change our own mind. That's one of those quality things. But we have to think about people taking time off for democracy. If they have to either take time away from their work or their family, people possibly feeling intimidated or excluded because public speaking is, it's right up there with, snakes in terms of things that people are afraid of. How can we, I think this is the question for the 21st century, is how can we take the best of our democratic heritage? I disagree with Zuckerman on some of those points, but the best of that heritage, and also include what we know about inclusion to bring the institution forward.
Sarah Wright, you told the Berkshire Eagle that you hope that this new format, when it's implemented in May, that it bolsters civic engagement and civic health. How are you going to know if it manages to have that effect?
Well, I do think, to Susan's point about quantity and to your question there about participation, I mean, I think, the numbers will tell us something. I do also agree that the quality of the conversation and the debate, the questions, the civility that I expect, to the basic decorum that I think all moderators hope for, and all town meeting members, I mean, when I look at the U.S. House of Representatives occasionally, and I see now that there are people who are shouting out, hurling insults, I just think yes, of course we've lost something, but that is not the tone that anyone wants, I don't think, from a fellow citizen or an elected official. And I do think that, again, with declining population as we have in the Berkshires and so many of our towns, where we struggle sometimes just to get people to run for the appropriate offices. I think anyone who shows up and everyone who shows up at annual town meeting wants to be heard, wants to listen to their fellow citizens and neighbors.
All right, well, good luck as you preside over this change. I hope it goes smoothly. Sarah Wright and Susan Clark, thank you both for talking this through.